A couple of years ago, I had the pleasure of visiting the Critical Global Studies Institute in Seoul, learn about its exciting projects involving global memory, especially a multi-year, multidisciplinary initiative called mnemonic solidarity. The director and founder of the Institute is our speaker today. Distinguished Professor of Transnational History, Sogang University. Professor Lim is a historian of Eastern Europe whose research and public work have broadened in recent years, as reflected in the titles of some of most recent books in English. Global Easts, Remembering, Imagining, Mobilizing, published by Columbia University Press. Mnemonic Solidarity, Global Interventions, published by Palgrave in 2021. And just this month, this book, Victimhood Nationalism, History and Memory in a Global Age, also from Columbia University. Memory activist, Professor Lim has co-curated a number of exhibitions, for example, Naming Forced Laborers, and has played a significant role in the continuing rethinking of memory studies. Recently, he's been involved in establishing the Global Easts Consortium, a forum for revisiting the conventional dichotomy between East and West and placing Eastern Europe and East Asia together into a global discourse. Conclusion of the talk, I'm going to mention his other appearances at Stanford. Without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Jie-Hyun Lim.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me, Roland, and also all the staff who made this meeting possible. And I'm really honored to share my ideas with all of you on this occasion. In Poland, this weather, we call it pogoda barowa, means the weather for vodka more than study. I'm sorry about that. But anyway, so we can stay here for about 2 hours to talk about and to share the ideas of victimhood nationalism. I have been working on this concept for more than 15 years. Actually, I coined this term in the year 2007. Then I thought it was quite, no, I can write a book quite quickly, but it appeared that it took more than 15 years to do this. So actually, this is a sort of global history works, including Poland, Germany, Israel, Japan, and Korea mainly. But even they are entangled in history, but also they were entangled in imagination about the past and imagination about history. So we can say that they are entangled histories of realities, but also entangled ideas or entangled imaginations about the past and present future, I would say. And this is the contents of the book. Actually, the first chapter is Mnemohistory, and last chapter is Beyond Mnemonic Eurocentrism. Actually, perhaps some of you might be interested in already in the memory studies. I think that since the Edward Said published his book, Oriental, but these memory studies, I think, still remains one of the most strong Eurocentrism prevails among the different disciplines in humanities. Sometimes it's reasonable or understandable because Holocaust was so dominant experience, and then nobody can deny that this is really overwhelming experience during the Second World War. So I think the Eurocentrism in memory studies is related with the overwhelming experience of the Holocaust. But on the other hand, also sometimes this dominant position of Holocaust in our global memory formation blocks a certain comparisons or entangled memories or even the approach from the colonial genocide things. So I will talk about this later. Mnemohistory. The first one is actually Witold Gula, the great Polish historian whom I respect very much. It's an excerpt from his diary. It means that in old times, Jews were envied for their money, qualification, positions, and international connections, network. But now they are envied for crematorium. It's very harsh wording, but in a sense, in 1970, I think he really this excerpt epitomized how the victim nationalism appeared on the scene. And then I define victim nationalism as a narrative template of history and memory, which grants a nation in the present the moral legitimacy by inheriting lived victim experiences of ancestors in the form of post-memory. Is there anyone who experienced Second World War in this room? There's nobody, right? But although nobody, my students in my class, they never experienced, colonial period because they were born in 2000, but the the colonialism ended in 1945. Despite that, many of them still regard themselves as victims of Japanese colonialism, right? That's why I say victimhood nationalism instead of victim nationalism. They were not real victims in history, but they regard themselves still as victims, whose that position has been inherited from their ancestors who were real victims. So victimhood nationalism is much more about memories or post-memories more than actual histories that has happened in the course of real history. And then in the Mnemohistory chapter, I try to combine methodology of global history with the methodology of memory studies in different ways. And second chapter of genealogy, why, and how could I be interested in that victim of nationalism? Actually, it came from my witness of the Polish debates on the memories. For example, in 1987, Jan Dworski is a literary critic. He wrote a wonderful essay, Tygodnik Powszechny, is a Polish weekly, about by citing poems by Czesław Miłosz. Czesław Miłosz was the Nobel Prize winner in literature in 1980, and two poems that he wrote during the Second World War in 1943, especially during the Ghetto Rising in 1943 and after the Ghetto Rising. This actually his original title was Poor Christians Looking at Ghetto, but Dworski twisted that title to Poor Poles Looking at Ghetto. He cited Campo di Fiori, that by Czesław Miłosz. Campo di Fiori is the square in Rome, actually where this Giordano Bruno, the Renaissance humanist, was, killed by the Inquisition. He was just burnt on the stake, right? While Roman citizens just was looking at with curiosity how these guys are dying, right? But he just put this experience of the Giordano Bruno's death in Rome in the Renaissance period, and 1943, a Jewish Ghetto Rising. So he put once on Rome, the Renaissance Rome, and once in the Ghetto Rising. In the way he tried to awaken Poles. What kind of difference do you have from those Roman citizens who just looked at Giordano Bruno, who was dying, on the stake in the Renaissance period? So in a sense, he just, how can I say, he picked up certain guilt consciousness of Poles as bystanders who was just looking at those victims. So this debate was really, really interesting, but it was not well known to the outside world except Poland. While, for example, this Jan Gross's neighbors were quite well known. But I think basically this debate is much more inspiring or much more intriguing in understanding the guilt and sinfulness and the shame and pride and all those different things. And also Zygmunt Bauman, I had an interview with him in the year 2002 and about the hereditary victimhood. Means that, nobody here is the actually experienced the Second World War. Despite that, they regard themselves as victims because they inherited the position of victims from their ancestors in memories. So Zygmunt Bauman coined the term of hereditary victimhood, especially to criticize aggressive Zionism in Israel. Already in the 1969, actually he was evicted from the Communist Party by the anti-Semitic campaign in 1968. He fled to Israel, but he said that in Israel, after 1 year staying in Israel, he found that oh my God, this is not a country that he wants to live. And then he found that why such an aggressive Zionism appeared in Israel despite their really bitter experience, right? With the Holocaust. And he just coined the term of hereditary victimhood to explain why this sort of aggressive Zionism has been prevalent in post-war Israel. And then I took this hereditary victimhood as a keyword to understand post-colonial historiography in Korea. In Korea, the Koreans always say that Koreans was the most victimized by the colonialism, but that's not true because they don't know any other history. Just they know the history of Japanese colonialism, but despite that, they always say that Korea is the nation which was most victimized by the colonialism. So in order to criticize Korean colonialism, I just took the edge of this conceptual edge of hereditary victimhood, 2002. Then in the year 2000, as many of you know, that there was a debate on the Jan Gross's neighbors, and it showed that Poles were not only bystanders, but some Poles were actually perpetrators in collaboration with Nazi Germans. This was a shock. So according to some journalists in Gazeta Wyborcza, they say that there was not even a single day in the year 2000 without mentioning neighbors, youngest neighbors. It was a really shock to not only academicians, but also to the ordinary Poles in general. And then Yoko Kawashima Watkins, this is an East Asian version of a Vertriebene. It's an expellees of expellees of Japanese settlers in Manchuria and the northern Korea. And upon the defeat of Japan, in the Second World War, they had to flee to Japan. On the way back to Japan, they suffered from sort of, revenge by Koreans and Chinese, also oncoming Red Army soldiers. So the story of this Hikiage story was very similar to the story of German Vertriebene German expellees after the Second World War. But what is intriguing is that this Yoko Kawashima Watkins, this book was translated into Korean in the year 2005. At that time, Korean press was relatively positive to this. Oh, this is Romanzbildung of a young Japanese girl. How after such a difficulty she could grow up as a quite responsible or quite reasonable adult. But suddenly in the year 2007, January 18, on a sudden day, all the Korean major newspapers began to criticize Yoko Kawashima Watkins' book. Something strange because Korean society is very much divided politically and ideologically. So both right-wing and left-wing newspapers were in concert to criticize such one small book is a very, very exceptional one. So I could see that certain invisible hand standing stood behind these sort of scenes. But main reason is that this Yoko Kawashima Watkins was a daughter of a young Japanese girl who had to flee from Northern Korea. If one reads this book, the Japanese were victims while the Koreans are perpetrators, right? Especially this book was adopted as a reading list, one of the reading lists in the a 7th, 8th grade in the United States in New York area and Boston area. So I found that Korean Americans began to criticize this book as a reading list. And so this is a typical long distance nationalism. In Korea, originally in the year 2005, it was just welcomed, although lukewarmly, but as a book, okay, it's about a very good book about the Bildungsroman. But suddenly in 2007, after the Korean Americans began to criticize this book in the United States, suddenly the criticism, came to Korea. So it is one of the very good examples to show how the long distance nationalism works out. And also it shows a certain entangled memory politics in the trans-Pacific spaces. So if one wants to understand memory culture or collect memories in any country around the Pacific Rim, we need really global historical approach or global memory studies to understand one collective memory of one nation. This is beginning. And the third chapter is sublimation. Actually, victim nationalism is not properly accurate term. I think that victim nationalism appears on the scene in the transition from victims to sacrifices. For instance, in German term Opfer, no, Polish term Ofiara or German term Opfer, it has this ambivalent. It has both connotations of victims and sacrifices. In English, victims and sacrifices are a little bit distinguished, but in the East Asian language, especially a scenographic world, this 피해자, 희생자 is clearly distinguished. So 피해자 is just some meaningless deaths or innocent victims. But sacrifice means that sacrifice oneself for the greater cause, mainly for the nation, for the fatherland. So in a sense, victim nationalism appears on the scene when the meaningless death is interpreted as a very meaningful sacrifice or willful sacrifice for the nation or for the fatherland. So one can say that this a typical one is that this unknown soldier's tomb is it's a typical example because it's a very good item because unknown soldiers, we don't know who they are. So we don't know what their political ideas are, what kind of political parties they were affiliated. So all the nation can really interpret who they are on their own terms. So these sort of things actually related with the emergence of political religion. So in the medieval period the pro-dominant mori, when the pro-dominant mori was translated into pro-patria mori, I think it really reflects a transition from victims into sacrifices and also emergence of victim nationalism. So this is Yasukuni Shrine. You know well about the East Asian debates on the Yasukuni Shrine, but this Yasukuni Shrine does exist not only in Japan. This is Jeonggukgyo. This is in the National Cemetery in Dongjakdong. We can have a Jeonggukgyo, but if we pronounce this in Japanese, it is Yasukuni Bashi. So Yasukuni is a name that is shared not only by almost all East Asian societies and the Chinese Jeongguk, this Kunming, there's still this a primary school named Yasukuni. So Yasukuni is not the typical Japanese peculiarity to show that how the Japanese remember this Second World War in a different way, but actually all the nation states in the East Asian context try to establish their own political religion, which those nationalism, which those nations, which those modern states as a sort of object of worship. This is so sublimation is a word to show how the victim nationalism actually works in the connection with the political religion or secular religion. And the globalization, globalization of memory is a very gradual process. But if someone imposed me to pick up just 1 year as a moment of the global memory formation, I would pick up the year 2000. There are 4 important events which shows that the emergence of global memory formation. The first one is January in the year 2000. There was a Stockholm Declaration. I think for the first time in the history of humanities, these political leaders like presidents and premiers, and then prime ministers, foreign ministers from 46 countries, they got together and they made this. They declared that Holocaust education and research is most important, and they told to East European countries, if you want to join the NATO, you should teach Holocaust. So for the first time, 46 countries, the politicians, they just manipulated certain history education as a sort of necessary, inevitable things for some political alliance. This one thing, and in the end of the 2000, there was a Women's International War Crime Tribunal, which actually is a sort of modeled on the Russia's civic tribunal. But in this tribunal, they prosecuted Japanese criminals for the comfort women case. But what is interesting is that in this international Women's International War Crime Tribunal, it was the prosecutors and judges, they were lawyers who took part in the trial of war criminals in the former Yugoslavia. So, so in the Srebrenica, there was a very brutal sexual violence against the Islamic women. And that scene was transmitted into TV in the many European countries. So people's awareness or people's sensitivity about the a sexual crime has been quite, how can I say, a sensitive, became very sensitive. And suddenly, with this, actually it was regarded as sexual violence, but now it became to be categorized as a crime, one of the crime against humanity. This is the December. Then the May 2000, the publication of Song Hsie's, a Polish version of Neighbors was published in Poland. There was a huge debate, and I would say this this was a historical strike in Poland in a sense. And also, it was not only Poland, but also it just actually triggered a historical debates or memory debates in East European countries, how those ordinary East Europeans actually collaborated with Nazi Germans and killed Jews. And they were not only victims, but also perpetrators in some contexts. So that debate was very important. And also in the year August 2000, German Bundestag made a resolution about the reparation to the forced labors from East European countries and Italy and France and all the occupied countries by Germany. So all these four events can be found in the year 2000. So also it's the first year of third millennium or last year of second millennium. I don't know. But anyway, so this sort of turning year, right? It's a sort of turning point. In the sense, this year 2000 was very important. But of course, before that, there was a globalization of memory. For instance, Yad Vashem and the Jewish Institute of History in Warsaw, they have argued who used the word of Holocaust for the first time in the public sphere. They say Yad Vashem, yes, it was we and the Polish Jews in the Jewish Institute of History in Warsaw, it was us. But both are wrong. It was for the first time we can find the official usage of a Holocaust from Nagasaki. In the Nagai Takashi, he is a Catholic medical doctor in Nagasaki, and he made a funeral address in Murakami Cathedral, the Catholic victims by the atomic bomb in Nagasaki. It was 1945, November 23rd. For the first time in the official this funeral address, he used the term of Hansai. Hansai, of course, it's not the Holocaust, but it's a Japanese or the scenographic translation of Holocaust. So it was neither Yad Vashem nor Jewish Institute of History in Warsaw, but it was Japanese Catholic doctor in Nagasaki who is known as a saint in Nagasaki, who used the term of the Hansai. This is Holocaust, although it was a translation of this the Holocaust. That's why this address was not known to the West, to the European part of the world, but we can say like that. Also, there was a very interesting connectivity of memories between African Americans and Jewish victims of Holocaust. In 1949, Du Bois, from the International Sociological Congress in Moscow on the way back to the United States, he dropped by Warsaw and he went to the ruins of Warsaw Ghetto. And while he was sitting by the ruins of Warsaw Ghetto, he thought that, oh, I could hear the cries of African American slaves from the ruins of Warsaw Ghetto. And also when the Convention of Genocide drafted by Raphael Lemkin was passed in the UN, the first international group to respond to the convention of this genocide was American Communist Party, especially African American members of American Communist Party. They made a book, We Charge Genocide. The main argument of this book is that these African American slaves, African Americans, were the first victims of genocide even before the Holocaust. And also Amy Cesar, his work, a discourses on colonialism, and actually it was a very sharp criticism against so-called Western bourgeoisie, and all the Western bourgeoisie has a Hitler inside themselves. But this is very interesting. Even his treatise on the colonialism was translated into Polish in 1949 in Poznan. In Poznan, there was a conference about this colonial people, something like that. At that time, it was translated already in 1949 into Polish. First English translation was done in 1976. So differently in the different block, we can find a interesting this connectivity of different sufferings, memories of different sufferings. This is globalization, I would say. This is We Charge Genocide, and this is Jewish life. Du Bois, as you see, he wrote a Negro and the Warsaw Ghetto, actually upon the request of the editor of the Jewish Life. And this is the 1972, in the Anne Frank's house, there was an exhibition organized jointly by the anti-apartheid the activists and in South Africa and Netherlands. So, but nowadays some countries regard those Afrikaners as the victims. Actually, in 1972, there was a certain connectivity of memories of those victims. But this is a very interesting, it's from the Modern Art Museum in Warsaw, 36 photos of very interesting. You can see the Buddhist monk, right? It is surrounded by the people, Europeans wearing this Auschwitz, this, how can I say, Auschwitz, some clothes. It says that actually it was 1962, some Japanese anti-A-bomb active memory activists, they organized a so-called, this is a Hiroshima. Oshibengchim is the place where the Auschwitz concentration camp was located. So Hiroshima, the Auschwitz peace march was organized by these Japanese peace activists from Hiroshima. So they just they started from Hiroshima for about 8 months to arrive in Auschwitz. And they took part in the ceremony of liberation of Auschwitz, January 27, 1963. It's the same thing. So really, international audiences who took part in this ceremony in the Auschwitz, liberation of Auschwitz. You can see. This is a Polish Janik Polski. Oh. Here, this is the first day of this liberation, and there was a press coverage of those Hiroshima Auschwitz peace march guys. But this globalization of memory actually has been in parallel with the nationalization or reterritorialization of memories. Memories were contested, a distasteful competition over who suffered most. How many people were dead there? Only 3 million? No, don't talk about this. This sort of very, very disgusting contest over who suffered most has been found quite often, quite frequently in the global memory formation. And also, I would say this, I just named politics of numbers. So numbers, to some guys, numbers are very important. For example, what's the difference between 6 million victims and 5.6 million victims? I don't see any such a big difference, but to some guys, this is very important. Why? Because if Polish victims are 6 million, 3 million ethnic Poles and 3 million Jews. But 5.6 million victims, 3 million Jews and 2.6 ethnic Poles. Means that Jews are more victimized than Poles. That sort of things sometimes could not be acceptable to some nationalists. And then also hierarchization of victims. For example, concentration camp and the extermination camp, it was done, this differentiation between these two camps was done by the Polish encyclopedia in 1967. But the editor-in-chief of this encyclopedia was a Jewish Polish communist. And the National Communist Wing raised a concern about this sort of differentiation. And it was actually start of this, beginning of this anti-Semitic campaign, actually run by the Communist Party in 1968. So, which victim is more important? This one and third one, actually also nationalization of victims, right? Once there was always sort of, ethnic hierarchization or certain differentiation, discrimination against minorities, but when they were counted as victims of our nation, suddenly they can get us equal footing with all the other main crimes victims. And yes, so there was some saying, for example, dead Jews are good, can be good Poles, means that when they are counted as victims of Polish nation, they are really, recognized as Poles in Russia. So 27 million Russian victims. So we don't know how the composition of those victims. Also, most recently, when baby Bush made the funeral address for the September 11 victims, he said only American nation, American people were victimized. But actually, 1/3 of those victims were non-Americans, right? But these non-Americans who are non-nationals has been always erased from these discourses on the victims. And Hiroshima and Auschwitz. Why Japanese was so concerned about the Auschwitz or Holocaust? Because for the Japanese ultra right-wing conservatives, Japanese people and the Jewish people were the two nations who were most victimized by white racism. So this America is A-bombed to Japan, while the Germans killed the Jews in the Holocaust. So in that way, Holocaust and the A-bomb victims have been connected, sometimes in the very much global ways, but sometimes very much way of nationalizing victims. Okay, I will keep. But also very interesting thing is that while Japanese national culture in 1960s memory culture redeemed the Holocaust as one of the most important things to remind themselves of these A-bomb victims, but Korean nationalists really adored Zionism. So I do remember when I was a primary school boy, Moshe Dayan was my hero. And recently I read a book by an Indian intellectual, Indian historian. He said in 1960s, Indian nationalists also adored Moshe Dayan, and he has a similar experience of remembering Israel like me. Oh, this is also rescue stunt. This is a Kaunas in Lithuania. This Sgiara Chiune who rescued the Jews. So sometimes this in the globalization of memories, sometimes people began to talk about how many Jews did you rescue, right? Was there anyone who risked one's life to rescue Jews in your country? Yes, Chinese. Oh, this is a concert, world premiere of a concert in the Kaunas. The left guy is the director of Yad Vashem, ambassador of Israel to Lithuania, and Japanese ambassador to Lithuania to commemorate this. This is 2022. Yes, Chinese found a Chinese diplomat who issued a visa to rescue Jews in Vienna. One more guy, there are Chinese swindlers and Japanese swindlers, but unfortunately, we don't have Korean Schindlers because it was colonized. And this is so humanity, port of humanity, Churga. This is these Jews who were saved by the Sugiyara arrived to Japan, and this small port is now celebrated and commemorated as by the Japanese memory culture as a way of showing that how do those Japanese intellectuals or diplomats risk their career to save Jews and so on. But that's not true, actually. So this is decontextualization. When Germans and the Japanese regard themselves as the most terrible victims, they decontextualize history. It's true, those vertriebene, German vertriebene Japanese Hikiage were victims, right? They were victimized. But when they are talking about those experience of their victims, they totally disregard historical context of Japanese colonial rule or Nazis, this aggressiveness or this terrible occupation policies. So all these things. So I mean, the expellees and POWs in Siberia, Allied bombing, and Japan is the only country which was A-bombed. So don't talk about these victims. We are the only country which has been A-bombed. So this sort of, how can I say, so prioritize or pecularize one's own victims can be found in this decontextualization. But different things also, Du Bois, yes, is a most important post-colonial literary critic and sociologist. But on the other hand, Du Bois, from the viewpoint of Korean and Chinese, Du Bois was too much pro-Japanese because he was very much in favor of those Pacific Negroes. The Japanese was called as Pacific Negroes by those African American communists in the interwar period. There was a certain very strong ties between these African American Marxists and Japanese colonialists or Japanese nationalists in the Pacific era. And this is an obsession with the Holocaust in Japan. So there are many interesting things. But over-contextualization, although as a nation, Korean nation or Polish nation or Jewish nation might be collectively victimized. But among these collective victims, there are also individual perpetrators, right? But all these individual perpetrators are hiding behind the screen of, oh, as a nation, we Polish nation, we were victimized most, Korean nation were victimized most. So those Raldansky brothers, these guys killed the Jews in Jedwabne, but they say that when the Anna Biconte, a Gazeta Viborsa journalist, had an interview, that this guy said, like the whole nation, we suffered from under the Germans, the Soviets, and People's Poland. So suddenly those killers of Jews, they pretend to be victims by the history. And Koreans, yes, Korean Presidential Committee of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, so-called leftist President Mnemohistory, that committee made a resolution that, oh, all these Korean POW, these guys who are actually prosecuted by the tribunal, and they were innocent victims by the Japanese colonial rule. In that way, how the individual perpetrators among the victimized nations actually could transform themselves into victims instead of perpetrators, that can be found. Juxtaposition is different. Maximilian Kolbe, he's a hero in Japan, and especially Japanese liberal and left-wing intellectuals like Maximilian Kolbe very much, because he was a missionary in Nagasaki from 1930 to 1936. But there was no mention at all that Maximilian Kolbe was an anti-Semite, right? So these sort of things can be found, and all these traces of Maximilian Kolbe in Nagasaki. So also compared to the Western missionaries, this Polish missionary was treated differently. Oh, these guys from East, and they don't speak English very well. And then, oh my God, for the first time, I saw the Western missionaries who came to Japan in the third class cabin of the ferry. These sort of things, in a sense, actually made the Japanese people closer to Maximilian Kolbe compared to other Western imperialist countries' missionaries. But this is also different stories and deniers. Yes, Denialist International call it. Now this David Duke's playground moved to Iran and the Middle East. So there, they already began to collaborate with the Iranian Iranian power, and they held organized the denialist conference to deny the Holocaust already in 2004. And also we have a closer look at these denialist discourses. Surprisingly, same or similar logic, similar grammars can be found, although different denialist discourses on different things. In Korea, in Poland, in Russia, almost everywhere. That I just categorize right denial, suspicion, and positivism in these things. And the forgiveness, this is I just pick up the Polish bishop's letter to German bishops, the very famous letter, bishop's letter. This is we could forgive and ask for forgiveness. This was really shocking document in 1965. So it gave this Communist Party to attack Catholic Church, who are national traitors and national betrayers who just betrayed Polish nation to the German fascists and something like that. But nowadays, this bishop's letter is regarded as one of the really avant-garde reconciliation documents by different groups of the scholars. So I tried, my university is Catholic Jesuit University, so I tried to show this, and then I tried to persuade Korean Catholic fathers, right, to take such approach to East Asia history reconciliation. Oh, we can't do that. Even so, I said, Catholic Church is the most oldest transnational institution. What are you doing? Oh, John, we can't do that. We will be just buried in the Korean society, something like that. So this is the final chapter. And this is is February of 2023. It's a 550th anniversary of birth of the Copernicus. And this guy is the mayor of the Torun, where the Copernicus was born. That was very interesting. He said that Copernicus was neither German nor Pole. He was a son of Torun. If any Polish politician addressed like that 20 years or 30 years ago, his political life on that day just will be gone. But nowadays, Paul said, "Oh yeah, he was a son of Torun." It's very anachronistic to call him whether argue whether he was a German or Pole. He was a son of Torun. So I mean that this sort of a change of, for example, national history paradigm from the national history paradigm to transnational history paradigm actually also very closely related with the change of memory culture and the transnational space or global space. Oh, somehow. This is many comforting photos. This one is San Francisco, right? This is in the Chinatown in San Francisco. Chinese American, the memory activists built this monument. So Korean, Chinese, and Filipinese, the girls, they are holding their hands, and the Kim Ak-sun, who just came up, made a coming out, to say publicly she was a comfort woman. She's just looking at those girls. And this is the Jewish Cultural Center in New York. And there was a meeting between Holocaust survivors and the former comfort women. So many Korean memory activists of comfort women tried to have a press conference, mainly in Jewish Cultural Center in the United States. This is both national and global, right? They try to appeal to the American audience who don't know well about East Asian history by citing Holocaust. But on the other hand, it is sort of, one can say, it's a nationalist appropriation of Holocaust memories in the United States to say that, oh, this comfort women case is really terrible and something like that. This one is most terrible thing. This is a Wiesent. Have you ever heard of Wiesent in Germany? It's 2,000 people are living there. And there's a Nepal Himalaya Park. And suddenly when the the memory activists of comfort women, they built a comfort women statue in Vision, Nepal Himalaya Park in Vision. I never know that. And my German friend who is a memory activist, she sent me an email. Jie-Hyun, the Korean people are very strange. Why did they build the comfort women in the Nepal Himalaya Park in Vision? No German knows that. And I just, traced the history. And then actually the guy who supported financially this project was a mayor of Suwon in the suburbs of Seoul, just before the local election. He needed certain, achievement, or this is totally, some people said, oh, this is really global. So even Germans began to recognize suffering of comfort women, but actually it is very much local politics in Korea has been actually involved in this sort of. This one is a little bit different. On the right side, this is Glendale. Glendale is the first California small town where the comfort women's stage was built. And I found strange, why Glendale? Then I found that Glendale is the Armenian American community. So in Glendale, one can live an everyday life even without speaking English. Only with Armenian one can live it. So local politicians in Glendale, those Armenian Americans, they were very deeply involved in the promoting comfort women cases. And also Ara Oshagan, who is the curator of this reflex space, which is a city museum in Glendale. He actually hosted and co-organized a series of exhibitions dedicated to the Holocaust, Armenian genocide, and comfort women, and so on, so on. So as we see, these four photos shows that how this actually globalization and the nationalization of memories have been intersected and intermingled, or re-territorialization and deterritorialization of memories have been intermingled. So I'll stop here. I'm sorry. Okay, I'll stop here. Yeah.
So I see too, in terms of this, the description of the book that you've given us here, and the work all around it. In a way, I see two competing conditions that are drawing your attention. One of them is the fact that a lot of history has a kind of nationalist template behind it, and that you're trying to, in not only this project, but in your Global East's consortium and all your other activities, you're trying to argue for a kind of transnational approach to history, which, as we can imagine, we know what the obstacles to that are, because there's a lot of disciplinary obstacles, there's a lot of political obstacles, and so on. On the other hand, it's clear from your sort of vernacular examples that ordinary people already think transnationally about a lot of historical events, that they, something that happened over here that maybe to historians, professional historians, is usually treated in a national context. Ordinary people have already made a comparison to something going on in a remote part of the world. And on the popular level, something makes sense about those kinds of homologies. How is this condition that I'm describing, is this sort of at the center of the project? And how do we get the two kinds of history, the popular history, the public history that involves these transnational or cross-national commemorations, how do we get them to talk to professional history, which it can be so nationally driven?
That's a question I want to ask also. It's very difficult, I think that, but also sometimes that sort of division, basically, I try to make, but also we can find very often they are intermingled, right? From the everyday life experience, they are quite far from this nationalist template. But on the other hand, we are always trained it in the schools and the universities on the way. Then suddenly, sometimes they are very much nationalistic, although sometimes they are very much far from this. So how can we find this moment? But this is a very specific, under the very specific context we can find out. Otherwise, if we just generalize, will be also very, very dangerous. But yes, I try to find a decent rupture between the memory template as a sort of a dominant ideology and also different everyday lives, everyday memories that ordinary people can take. But it's still very difficult. They are really very often intermingled. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a great talk. I can't wait to read the book, which is a big one I saw. So my question is about sort of what you mentioned in the, I think, second and third slide about sacrifice and victimhood. It seems to me there is a sort of maybe even a global history of changing ideas of what sacrifice might mean, right? If you look at the sort of late 19th century, early 20th century, especially in Catholic societies, you had this sort of cult of the soldier, cult of the sacrificial act of the hero who goes out. I think in France also very much after the Franco-Prussian War and after World War I, and then in a sense, so that also goes into what George Moss writes about this in Fallen Soldiers, the cult of the unknown soldier and that kind of thing. And then at some point, and this is I think where you come in, there was a way in which the sacrifice of the hero is someone who's already validated by his, in most cases his actions, his courage, and all that. And you have the victimhood, or the victim being a sacrifice, which is a different thing, which is not before the act, but after you die, right? So, and that seems to be very much, I mean, the Holocaust is obviously a watershed there, and World War II, but then I think it becomes a much bigger thing, right? The way in which, even on a global scale, in which you think of sacrifice as something that sort of, imputed retroactively, as it were, to people who were victims without necessarily being, heroes or being sacrificers themselves, right? Or people. So what accounts for that, do you think? I mean, that shift, this is sort of at the heart of your book, but what happens to the sort of relationship between the sacrificial act and the victim as the sacrificial victim, but someone who is then retroactively, although maybe the death itself or the individual act or whatever may not have been heroic in any way or have been implicated in any of the events that led to the death. So how is this a kind of larger historical shift that sort of describes the 20th century and what happens to the sacrificer in that?
I mean, this is usually the people who interpret the meaning of those sacrifices, right? The people who survive death, really, that people cannot say, right? So we don't know actually what he thought or she thought when he was dying. Well, bullshit, I shit my country, shit the war. But after their death, we always interpret this, this is sublime sacrifice and something like that. So always this sacrifice things actually is very much a project by the state. But especially after the First War, as you said, George Moss's, fallen soldiers, right? Almost same in Japan, the Yasukuni Shrine, it was a fun park. In the late 19th century, people were drinking and dancing. It's a fun park. But suddenly after the Sino-Japanese War, it began to be changed into these sacred places to bury the dead soldiers, fallen soldiers who sacrificed themselves for the country. So even the Corradini, Italian fascist, he wrote explicitly, we should learn from Japan how to make a political religion, how to persuade people to be willing to die for the country. So this sort of almost simultaneously in East Asia. In Chinese case, I don't know where, but in Japanese case, visibly apparently we can say that. But in the European case, the First World War was a really watershed, right? To shift a culture from mourning to sublimation of that for the country. So these sort of things, in a sense, so for example, a mourning of the dead people in the late 19th century till the late 19th century in East Asia was that if we do not mourn themselves properly, these guys will come back to our secular lives and they will revenge us. So they were afraid of those dead ghosts would come back to us. So that's why they mourn. But visibly, Yasukuni Shrine showed us the change of this culture of mourning from that sort of pre-modern or different things to a modern this political religion and pro-patria mori.
Can I follow?
Yeah.
So thank you, but isn't it the case that, I mean, for a sacrifice to be a sacrifice, what has to be killed has to be a value, right? So the hero, the military hero is already of some sort of value. So in very hierarchical societies like Japanese or whatever, how do you then attribute value to a life that maybe wouldn't have been mournable or value otherwise, right? So there's a kind of validation or a valuation process that has to happen, right?
Yeah, I got the point. Because for the political religion, I think democratization of death is inevitable. If for example, there's a difference between sacrifices and martyrs. Martyrs are only selected, elite group can be regarded as martyrs. But these sacrifices in the political religion, just ordinary people, right? Not aristocrats, just sons and the peasants and sons of just merchants who died in the battle for the fatherland. They are just commemorated as a sacred sacrifice for the fatherland. So there's a certain gap between a collective mourning of death in the spirit of martyrs. It was very much, as you said, hierarchical or before the nation things. But with the nation state, political religion always is connected with the collective mourning of the dead soldiers, regardless of their statuses, regardless of their properties, regardless of their professions. So I would say democratization of the dead is a precondition for this political religion.
I have
Yes.
May I?
Yeah.
So, well, thank you very much for this profound talk. So you mentioned that these are two things. One was the victimhood nationalism, which is you really just really gave a really global picture of this. And at the same time, you mentioned this globalization of memory. And I think these two have a little bit of intention between, and I want to go back to the bishop's statements of we forgive and forgive us. And then somehow, if you take that, I'd like to know what it is. And then this victimhood nationalism seems to be very complicated. At the same time, is somehow sick. Then how this memory from this perspective is different from some of the global memory of, we need to, as a human race or transnational, we need to remember something. So how you explain this tension and how this bishop's perspective gives some kind of insight to this problem?
Yeah, I mean, this bishop's letter, when I read this bishop's letter, I was really surprised with a pleasure. And in 1965, this Kominek, Boleslav Kominek from the Wrocław, he was actually bilingual. He wrote this bishop's letter in German. And, Wrocław is Breslau, is very much German also city. And then, but not only about this, how can I say, about the historical reconciliation. In 1965, his language, his terms already implies transnational historical states, right? I mean, the German colonialists in the medieval period, he he approaches to this differently. Also, he tried to use different wording from the Communist parties, this regain the territory and something like that. Even so, this is neither a national communist nor so-called this capitalist nationalist. He really his grammar of describing this transnational history between Germany and Poland was very exceptional at that time, by that time. And the transnational history appeared on the scene only in the late 1990s, I don't know, early this century. Then compared to this is really avant-garde documents, I would say. So this year, a Polish committee to register this bishop's letter as a UNESCO heritage of documentation, they are now trying to register this as a UNESCO heritage of document.
Thank you, Professor, for the.
Karen, she raised her hand first.
Oh, I actually did before, like.
Oh, okay. Then you can wait. Okay.
Thank you anyway for the enlightening speech. And my question actually started with the same PowerPoint that you have right now. So a little bit thanks to the second questioner, though. So it starts with the cultural subtlety that I want to mention, because I myself learn a bit of German, so I know like the subtleties of the word Opfer. Like it both means like victims and sacrifices, but I didn't know this point beforehand. So when you mentioned that, I was quite enlightened. But I was like more drawn to the comparison or the analogy that we can draw between, you know, this kind of German words and the Japanese narrative of the Yakusuni shrine. So in the winter vacation, I actually had an exchange, kind of like a program between, you know, Peking University, my university, and the University of Tokyo. And I asked the Japanese students about the questions of Yakusuni Shrine. So they tell me that the Japanese governments actually have, you know, concluded by them, but not the governments themselves itself, but like two intentions of why like prime ministers of Japan always commemorates all the, you know, war heroes in a shrine. So first is about remembrance. Like they have to remember like what's, be it tragedies, be it Holocaust or stuff like that, what the, you know, Japanese have done in all these kinds of wars. Not like the most monumental should be the second Sino-Japanese, but also, you know, the first Sino-Japanese and the Russian-Japanese war included as well. And that's and also the kind of promise and commitments the Japanese government actually have made previously, like beforehand, before they actually sacrifice and, you know, sacrifice for their fatherland. You know, the government saying that they will have a decent burial and they will be glorified when they are, you know, joining the like the kamikaze troops or stuff like that. That's the first intention. The second intention is about, you know, the sacrifice stuff, as you just mentioned here, as a sublimation, right? And also it reminds me of another example evidence that you just brought up, I think previous to this slide. I forgot the name of the book, but the book that was quite well received in 2005 and suddenly got criticized in 2007, like by the Korean media, stuff like that. Yeah, that book. You know what I'm talking about, right? And so now comes to my final question. Given that, I'm Chinese, and I've been raised in a Chinese environment, say like, you know, all the blames and I wouldn't call it like scapegoating, but you know how, you know, people been viewing negatively about Yakushuni Shrine, and you know there are Chinese who are doing some like, in my point of view, vulgar things at the shrine, and you know, just to simply saying that there should be no existence of such thing on earth at all, like expressing their anger as such a kind of like a holified convene in another nation. And so like, let's be more concrete instead of being, you know, kind of like abstract with of how this lecture has been. Instead, given that if the nationality of these two countries, say it like in this context, maybe China and Japan, like they're established in a kind of like an opposing narrative, right? Because you see, like in Yakushuni Shrine, the kind of narrative given by the government or the Japanese religion has been, you know, the Japanese have been victims. Japanese themselves have been suffering from the military control, suffering from the, you know, unreasonable commands of the government, right? And you see like the Chinese, of course, they're the victims in the like the first and the second Sino-Japanese war. And given that, you know, this kind of nationality and the solidarity established is so like what the basis is so opposing, like so there's such a strong tension between them. How is anyhow like the communication between those youngsters and or even like elderlies that are cultivated and raised in such an opposing narrative, opposing education? How could final communication or even like understanding possible, especially for the youngsters, though, because you see, because of the media or the polarized stuff, yet communication has become really, really difficult, right? So how is that anyhow possible, and what are some concrete suggestions or ways that we can actually promote and enhance like mutual understanding? Yeah, that would be it.
In a sense, all the war dead were victims because they were killed. But problem is that all the ordinary Japanese regard themselves as victims by the vicious military leaders. And all the Germans and Austrians, competed for the position who was victimized for the first time by Hitler, although they supported Hitler in a sense. So all these sense, from the viewpoint of social history, those position of victims, right? This is very problematic. Actually, it makes people escape from the responsibility for what happened with their massive participation, right? So in this sense, first of all, these Japanese were just victimized by the vicious military leaders is also sort of myth or self-indulgence. It can give the ordinary Japanese self-indulgence. Secondly, it is related with the Scaps Orientalism. Oh, Japanese people tend to be subservient to the political power always. They don't stand against political power. They always survive. So very much American, this occupation army Scaps, a Orientalist view of Japanese, actually is resonant with the Japanese, the efforts to make themselves as self-indulgent. So we should be very careful about these things. Ordinary Japanese, ordinary Germans, even all the Italians say that they were victimized by Mussolini and the German occupation army. Is that true? How could they select this very strange prime minister today? So these sort of things is very be careful. And secondly, it is related with the Yasukuni Shrine. Yasukuni Shrine, every state has its own Yasukuni Shrine. As Korean, this Yasukuni Bashi in the national cemetery. But in Japan's case, there are two different things. One is these war criminals are actually their names are kept in the Yasukuni Shrine in this book. And the second one is Koreans and Okinawans and Taiwanese who were mobilized to the Japanese army. Their names also are just kept in the Yasukuni Shrine. And we don't know. They were really, really wanted to die for the Japanese empire, or they were forced to do a military service, right? But when these Japanese prime minister politicians makes a tribute to Yasukuni Shrine, they presuppose that all those Koreans and Taiwanese were actually willing to die for our fatherland at the time, Japan's empire. Although after the war, all those Koreans and Taiwanese, they were deprived of the citizenship of Japanese, so they were totally outside of this welfare system. So this is much more complicated. It's not that simple in the Yasukuni Shrine case.
One last question.
I'm sorry.
I have two thoughts as I've listened to you, Jie-Hyun. And one of them is that this is a very contemporary historiographical problem. It's the late 20th and 21st century historiographical problem. I work on earlier periods, and you couldn't do this kind of comparison, I think, earlier. So it's kind of a new stage, right? I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. But the second piece of this is that there also seems to be a common psychological element among humans, wherever they come from, to think in these terms. And I'd like to see what you have to say about that.
Yeah, with the first question, okay, let me start with the second question. It's I think historical more than psychological. If you ever look at the main currents of the nationalist discourse in 1940s, 1950s, immediately after Second World War, heroes. Heroes are more important than victims. But I think that our concern about victimhood is related with the rise of a human rights regime in general. So, and the global memory formation, the rise of global memory culture actually tends to put the emphasis on the victims. And then people used to tend to think that, okay, having a position of victim almost automatically justifies one's own activity, one's own thing. So that's why victimhood nationalism suddenly replaces the heroic nationalism, right? This is first thing. First question was, your first question was?
The first question was about the situation of the historian.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know. I have been a street historian more than an archive historian. So I think that we tried very hard to do a political regime change, and then we said, okay, the Korean society democratized, and Poland was democratized after 1990s. But these twins, we talked about these twins, peace and Korean also, this martial law in December shows that something changed, but something didn't change. What kind of transformation or kind of change can be possible? And I was thinking of this, I just call it memory regime change. Political regime change is not enough. It is not backed up by the memory regime change. Political regime change is always very much limited. So in a sense, memory regime change presupposes change of the grassroots culture. Yes, of course, there was a very interesting joke in Soviet Union. This future is very much predictable based on the historical material, but past cannot be predicted because it is always on the change. So, I mean, this shows that how this memory regime change is very complicated things. And also, it is not the national project. It is really a transnational or global project. How can we do? But at least we can start by pointing out how. So you said comparative, right? But I prefer entangled more than comparative. I don't want comparative, but actually those memories are entangled very closely. Although actual causes of history were not entangled, right? Comfort women never met a Holocaust, things. But in their memory, they are now began to be entangled. So how can we approach these entangled memories? I think is one of the very important points.